Imagine walking through the English countryside on a foggy autumn morning. You're following an ancient path that winds between villages, and you notice something strange. The locals avoid this route entirely. They take longer ways around, even when this path would save them miles. When you ask why, they give vague answers about old customs, about respect, about things best left undisturbed. This path, they tell you, was never meant for the living. It belonged to the dead. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. These roads existed. They still exist, actually, carved into the landscape of northern England like scars that never quite healed. They have many names: corpse roads, coffin roads, churchways, lichways. Each name tells the same story. For centuries, these paths served a single, specific purpose. They were the routes along which dead bodies traveled to their final resting place. And for reasons both practical and supernatural, the living simply did not use them. Why would a society create separate roads exclusively for transporting corpses? What made these paths so different that even centuries later, some locals still avoid them? By the end of this exploration, you'll understand how geography, religious politics, medieval practicality, and deep human psychology combined to create one of the strangest transportation systems in European history. The story begins with a simple problem. In medieval England, not every village had the right to bury its dead. This wasn't just tradition, it was law, enforced by the church with remarkable strictness. Burial in consecrated ground, ground blessed by religious authority, was considered essential for the soul's journey after death. Without it, medieval Christians believed the dead might wander, unable to find peace. But consecrated ground was scarce, and the church controlled it absolutely. Many remote villages, particularly in the mountainous regions of Yorkshire, Cumbria, and the Lake District, had no local churchyard. They had small chapels, perhaps, where people could pray and hear occasional services. But these chapels lacked burial rites. The mother church, sometimes 15 or 20 miles away, across difficult terrain, held the monopoly on burials. And so, when someone died in these villages, their body had to make a journey. This wasn't a matter of loading a coffin into a cart and traveling along the main road. Medieval roads were rough, often impassable in winter. More importantly, there was a profound reluctance to mix the living and the dead in daily travel. The funeral procession needed its own path, a dedicated route that would carry the deceased from their home village to the distant churchyard where they could finally rest. These corpse roads developed organically over generations. They followed the most direct routes possible, often cutting straight across moorland where regular roads curved around obstacles. They crossed private land because ancient custom granted funeral processions rite of passage. They forded streams at specific points where the water was shallow enough for bearers carrying a heavy coffin. Over centuries of use, these paths wore into the landscape itself, becoming physically distinct from surrounding terrain. The names themselves are fascinating. Corpse Road is the most direct, the most unsettling to modern ears. Coffin Road suggests the same thing with slightly less emphasis on decay. Church Way sounds almost pleasant until you understand its specific meaning, distinguishing it from regular roads to church used by the living for Sunday services. Lichway draws from the Old English word for corpse, lich, which also appears in Lichgate. the covered gateway at churchyard entrances where coffin bearers could rest. In the Lake District, you can still walk these routes. The Corpse Road from Mardale to Shap Abbey stretches about 10 miles across open fell country. Local historians have documented its course precisely, noting the corpse stones, flat rocks where bearers set down their burden to rest aching shoulders and backs. Near Rydal, another corpse road runs to Ambleside, crossing terrain so beautiful that modern hikers use it without knowing its original purpose. They walk where funeral processions once traveled in grim silence. Physical markers remain. Some corpse stones still bear the worn impressions where countless coffins rested. Stone crosses mark dangerous crossing points, or places where bearers traditionally paused for prayer. In some locations, you can see where the path has worn deeper into the earth than surrounding ground, testament to centuries of foot traffic. The landscape remembers. What's remarkable is how widespread these roads were. This wasn't a peculiarity of one region. Across northern England, anywhere with scattered settlements and centralized church burial rites, corpse roads developed. Each had its own character, its own stories, its own rules that local communities understood implicitly. Some were just a few miles long. Others required journeys of 20 miles or more, taking 2 or even 3 days to complete. Consider what this meant practically. When someone died, their family faced not just grief, but logistical complexity. They had to organize bearers, usually neighbors and family members who would volunteer or be obligated by custom to help. They had to prepare the body for a journey that might last days. They had to choose the right season if possible, though death rarely waits for convenient weather. They had to follow a route that everyone knew, but few traveled regularly because it existed outside normal life. The separation between life and death was physical, mapped onto the landscape itself. You had roads for commerce, for visiting neighbors, for traveling to market. And you had other roads, parallel to daily life, but fundamentally apart, that served only one purpose. Medieval people understood instinctively that these paths belonged to a different realm of existence. This separation wasn't just practical, it was psychological and spiritual. The corpse road represented a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. When a funeral procession set out along these paths, they were beginning a liminal journey, accompanying the deceased across the threshold between one state of being and another. The road itself became a kind of passage, neither fully in the realm of the living, nor yet in the sanctified space of the churchyard. Think about what it meant to live near one of these roads. Your home stood beside a path used exclusively for carrying the dead. On foggy nights, you might hear footsteps, never quite certain whether they belonged to a belated funeral procession or something else. Your children would grow up knowing that certain routes were forbidden, not by law, but by custom so strong it might as well be law. The landscape of your daily life included these arteries of death, unavoidable reminders of mortality woven into geography itself. The question becomes, why didn't people just use regular roads? Why create separate paths at all? Part of the answer is practical. Regular roads followed routes convenient for wheeled vehicles and livestock. They curved around obstacles, took easier grades, connected population centers. Corpse roads could be more direct because bearers on foot could navigate terrain impossible for carts. Time mattered when transporting a decomposing body. The shortest route, even if difficult, was often preferable. But practical considerations don't fully explain the separation. Medieval people created these distinct paths because they believed the dead required their own space. Mixing funeral processions with ordinary travel felt wrong, almost dangerous. There were beliefs about spirits following bodies, about the contamination of death, about maintaining proper boundaries between life and its ending. The corpse road embodied these beliefs in physical form. We'll explore those beliefs in depth later. For now, understand that corpse roads represented a complete system, a medieval solution to the problem of how to move the dead through a landscape where death needed its own geography. These weren't random footpaths. They were structured, understood, laden with meaning and ritual. They had rules, both practical and supernatural. They shaped how communities experienced mortality. Today, many of these roads still exist as footpaths, popular with hikers who may not know their history. Others have vanished, plowed under, or overgrown, surviving only in place names and local memory. But their existence tells us something profound about how our ancestors organized their relationship with death. They created infrastructure for mortality, paths that acknowledge death's presence while keeping it carefully separate from daily life. As we continue this exploration, we'll walk these roads together, understanding their geography, their rituals, the beliefs that surrounded them. We'll meet the people who traveled them, carrying their dead across moors and mountains. We'll discover why some of these journeys took days, what happened along the way, what rules governed these somber processions. We'll explore the supernatural fears that kept the living away and the economic realities that made these roads necessary in the first place. The corpse roads of medieval England represent something unique in human history, a transportation network designed exclusively for the dead. They remind us that death once had its own geography, its own paths through the world. Understanding these roads means understanding how dramatically our relationship with mortality has changed, and perhaps what we've lost in that transformation. To understand corpse roads, we need to understand the medieval religious landscape, which was nothing like the world we know today. England was divided not just politically, but spiritually, carved into parishes that controlled something more valuable than land or gold, the right to bury the dead. The parish system that governed medieval England was extraordinarily rigid. At its center stood the parish church, often called the Mother Church, which held exclusive rights over baptisms, marriages, and burials within its territory. These weren't suggestions or preferences. They were legal monopolies enforced by both church and civil authority. A parish church might serve dozens of surrounding villages and hamlets, some incredibly remote, but all these communities owed their spiritual obligations to that single central location. This system created an immediate geographical problem. England's terrain is varied and often challenging. The flat, easily traversed south and east are one thing, but move into the north, into Yorkshire, Cumbria, the Lake District, and you encounter mountains, moors, deep valleys, fast-flowing rivers. Settlements scattered across this landscape often sat 15, 20, even 25 miles from their designated parish church. In medieval terms, with medieval roads and medieval travel speeds, this meant journeys of a full day or more. Now imagine you live in one of these remote villages. Your community has, perhaps, 50 or 100 people. You have a small chapel, maybe just a room where traveling priests occasionally say Mass. You can pray there, you can gather there, but you cannot be buried there. The ground beneath that chapel is not consecrated. It has no religious authority. When someone dies, their body must travel to the mother church for proper burial in sanctified ground. Why was this so important? To medieval Christians, burial in consecrated ground wasn't just custom or tradition. It was essential for salvation. The church taught that souls needed proper burial rites, performed by ordained clergy, in ground, specifically blessed for this purpose. Without it, the dead might become restless spirits, unable to enter heaven, doomed to wander. This belief went so deep that being denied church burial was one of the most severe punishments the church could impose, reserved for suicides, excommunicated persons, and those who died in mortal sin. The church's control over burial rites was also intensely political and economic. Every burial came with fees. These payments, along with offerings and donations, formed a substantial portion of church income. Mother churches protected their monopolies fiercely because losing burial rights meant losing revenue. There are documented cases of legal disputes between parishes lasting decades, arguing over which church had the right to bury residents of particular villages. The dead were valuable, economically speaking. Consider the specific example of Mardale, a tiny village in what's now Cumbria. Mardale sat in a remote valley, surrounded by fells and mountains. Its nearest parish church with burial rites was at Shap, roughly 10 miles away across some of England's most challenging terrain. When someone died in Mardale during winter, when snow blocked the passes, the body might have to wait weeks before the journey could begin. Yet the alternative, burial in unconsecrated ground, was simply unthinkable. The corpse road from Mardale to Shap climbed steep hillsides, crossed exposed moorland where wind and rain could turn a journey treacherous, forded streams that ran fast with snowmelt in spring. Bearers carrying a coffin would need most of a day to complete the journey in good weather. In bad weather, it might take 2 days, requiring an overnight stop somewhere along the route. Yet for generations, every person who died in Mardale made this journey. There was no alternative. Similar situations existed across northern England. From Rydal to Ambleside, about 6 miles, the corpse road crossed terrain so steep that bearers needed extraordinary strength and coordination. From Wasdale Head to Eskdale, another Lake District route stretched nearly 12 miles across mountain passes. Each of these paths emerged from necessity, worn into the landscape by funeral processions that had no other option. The terrain itself shaped how these roads developed. Unlike regular roads, which curved to avoid steep grades and followed valleys where possible, corpse roads often took more direct routes. Bearers on foot could navigate paths impossible for carts or horses. They could cross streams on stepping stones, climb steep hillsides, traverse narrow mountain passes. The urgency of transporting a decomposing body meant that shorter routes, even if more difficult, were often preferable to longer but easier paths. Water crossings presented particular challenges. Medieval England had few bridges outside major towns. Most streams and rivers required fording, which meant getting wet. For funeral processions, this created specific problems. Bearers needed to keep the coffin dry and stable while crossing potentially dangerous currents. Over time, traditional crossing points developed where the water was reliably shallow and the bottom solid enough for safe passage. These fords became part of the corpse road's known geography, points that everyone understood and respected. The seasonal variation in these journeys is worth considering. A person who died in summer when days were long and weather relatively stable, had a very different funeral journey than someone who died in the depths of winter. Summer deaths allowed for daylight travel, warm temperatures that at least delayed decomposition slightly, and passable paths. Winter deaths meant short days, potential for snowstorms, frozen ground, and the very real possibility of bearers becoming lost or trapped in deteriorating weather. Some villages had small chapels that technically could have accommodated burial, but lacked the consecrated ground designation. This wasn't a matter of physical unsuitability. The ground was perfectly capable of accepting bodies. It was purely a matter of religious authority. The bishop and the mother church held the power to consecrate ground, and they exercised that power selectively. Granting burial rights to a remote chapel meant reducing the mother church's income and authority. Economic incentives worked against decentralization. There's also the question of who decided where churches could offer burial rights in the first place. This was determined during the early medieval period, when Christianity was establishing itself across England. Powerful monasteries and established churches received these rights, often based on historical precedents or political influence. Once granted, burial rights became property, defended legally and sometimes physically. Changing this system required going through church hierarchy, a process that could take generations. For poor families, the economics of long-distance burial created additional hardship. Burial fees at the mother church were unavoidable. But beyond that, organizing bearers, preparing the body for travel, potentially paying for overnight shelter during multi-day journeys, all added costs. Some communities developed mutual aid systems where neighbors agreed to serve as bearers for each other's dead, spreading the burden. But even this required able-bodied people willing to undertake difficult, unpleasant journeys. During plague years, when deaths multiplied exponentially, the system nearly collapsed. Parish churches found themselves receiving dozens or hundreds of bodies in short periods. The corpse roads saw constant traffic, funeral processions passing each other on the same paths. The logistics became overwhelming. Some plague victims were buried in mass graves, sometimes in unconsecrated ground out of sheer necessity, though this violated everything medieval Christians believed about proper burial. The Reformation in the 16th century began changing these patterns. Protestant theology placed less emphasis on consecrated ground and physical burial location. The economic and political power of the old church system broke down. Gradually, more communities gained the right to establish local burial grounds. But by then, corpse roads had been in use for centuries. They were so deeply embedded in local geography and custom that many continued to be used long after alternatives existed. Even today, when you walk these routes, you can read the landscape story. The paths are often sunken, worn deeper than surrounding ground by centuries of foot traffic. They follow ridge lines and valley bottoms, taking advantage of natural features that made the journey slightly easier. Where they cross streams, you can sometimes still find the traditional fording points, marked by particularly smooth stones, worn by countless crossings. The geography itself bears witness to these journeys. Compare this with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, which developed similar systems. The basic problem was the same: scattered populations, centralized church authority, difficult terrain. But each region adapted differently. Scottish corpse roads often included stone shelters called morthouses, where bodies could rest overnight. Welsh traditions included specific prayers at certain landmarks along the route. Ireland developed elaborate keening customs performed at particular points during the journey. The underlying geography of death was universal, but cultural responses varied. The corpse roads also created unusual property situations. A path crossing your land that was used exclusively for funeral processions couldn't be blocked or diverted. Ancient right-of-way customs protected these routes, even when they inconvenienced landowners. Some property deeds specifically mentioned corpse roads, documenting their existence and protecting their continued use. The dead, in a sense, had permanent easement rights across the landscape. What's fascinating is how this system persisted for so long, despite its obvious impracticality. Why didn't communities simply demand local burial rights? They did, repeatedly, for centuries. But the Church's power, both spiritual and temporal, was immense. Challenging burial monopolies meant challenging fundamental church authority. It meant risking excommunication, social ostracism, and genuine fear for your soul's fate. The system continued, not just because of legal structure, but because of deep belief in its spiritual necessity. The geography of death in medieval England reveals something profound about how space and belief intersect. These roads weren't just practical solutions to transportation problems. They were physical manifestations of a worldview where death required its own dedicated infrastructure, where the journey from life to burial carried deep spiritual significance, where the landscape itself needed to accommodate mortality as a distinct category of existence. Understanding these roads means understanding a world where geography and theology were inseparable, where every journey to the grave was also a journey through sacred space. Now let's walk alongside a funeral procession on a corpse road, experiencing what the journey actually entailed. This wasn't a simple matter of carrying a body from one place to another. Every aspect of these journeys was governed by custom, ritual, and harsh practical necessity. The journey began at the moment of death. The body needed to be prepared quickly, especially in warmer months when decomposition accelerated. In medieval villages, this work fell to women of the community who specialized in preparing the dead. They washed the body, dressed it in a burial shroud, and in some cases, packed it with herbs and substances meant to slow decay. Rosemary, lavender, and other aromatic plants served dual purposes, masking the smell of death and invoking symbolic protection for the soul's journey. Coffins were not always used, particularly among poorer families. A simple wooden bier, essentially a stretcher, might carry the shrouded body. Wealthier families could afford proper coffins, usually simple wooden boxes constructed locally. The coffin needed to be sturdy enough to withstand a journey of many miles over rough terrain, with handles or ropes that allowed multiple bearers to share the weight. A body with its coffin could easily weigh 200 pounds or more, a tremendous burden to carry for hours or days. Selecting the bearers was a community responsibility governed by complex, unwritten rules. Family members of the deceased typically served as bearers, but not alone. Neighbors, friends, and sometimes simply able-bodied men from the village were expected to participate. In some communities, burying the dead was considered a sacred duty that one could not refuse without serious social consequences. The number of bearers varied, usually between 4 and 8, rotating positions to distribute the exhausting work. The procession assembled at the deceased's home or the village chapel. Before departure, prayers were said, Though without a priest present, these were often simple recitations led by whoever in the community could read or remembered the proper words. Then the journey began, following the corpse road that everyone knew from childhood, though few had walked its full length while living. The pace was necessarily slow. Bearers carrying heavy weight over rough terrain could not rush. Walking speed might average 2 miles per hour on flat ground, slower on hills, slower still when navigating difficult crossings. A 10-mile journey could easily take 6 to 8 hours, longer if weather turned bad, or bearers needed extended rest periods. The procession moved in silence or with minimal conversation, a custom rooted partly in respect and partly in superstition about attracting unwanted spiritual attention. Rest stops were crucial, and this is where corpse stones enter the story. These were flat stones, or natural rock outcroppings, positioned at intervals along the route, specifically placed for funeral processions to set down their burden. You can still find these stones scattered across northern England, often with worn depressions where countless coffins rested. The spacing between corpse stones reflected realistic human endurance, usually every mile or so on flat ground, more frequently on difficult terrain. At each corpse stone, the procession would halt. Bearers gratefully set down the coffin, resting aching shoulders and backs. Water might be shared, prayers might be spoken. Then, after perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, the journey resumed. These stops were necessary, but also ritualized, becoming expected moments within the larger ceremony of transporting the dead. Some corpse stones were marked with crosses, blessing the resting place and the souls who paused there. Weather was an ever-present concern. A funeral procession caught in heavy rain faced misery. Bearers struggled with slippery footing while trying to protect the coffin from becoming waterlogged and even heavier. Wind on exposed moorland could knock exhausted men off balance. Fog presented the danger of losing the path entirely, a serious risk in areas where straying from the route meant falling into bogs or down steep hillsides. Summer heat accelerated decomposition, making the journey increasingly unpleasant as hours passed. Winter journeys presented the greatest challenges. Snow could hide the path completely, making navigation treacherous. Ice made slopes deadly. Short winter days meant that long journeys might require traveling in darkness, with bearers carrying lanterns or torches, adding eerie visual drama to an already somber occasion. Some winter deaths resulted in bodies being stored, waiting for weather to clear enough to attempt the journey. But waiting too long created its own problems as decomposition continued. For journeys requiring multiple days, overnight arrangements were necessary. Some corpse roads had designated stopping points, small structures, or even just sheltered areas where the body could rest overnight. In other cases, the procession might seek hospitality at a farmhouse or inn along the route. This created awkward social situations. Allowing a corpse to shelter overnight in your home was considered both a Christian duty and something to be avoided if possible. The belief that spirits followed bodies made people deeply uncomfortable with housing the dead overnight. River and stream crossings were particularly dangerous moments. Traditional fording points were known and used, but water levels varied with season and recent rainfall. Bearers had to coordinate carefully to keep the coffin level and stable while crossing, often with water reaching their knees or higher. A dropped coffin in a fast current could be disastrous, both practically and spiritually. Some crossings had stepping stones or crude plank bridges, but many required simply wading through. There were rules about who could join the procession. Immediate family certainly participated, though women sometimes remained behind, their presence considered either improper for such journeys or simply impractical for the physical labor involved. Children rarely came along, partly because of the difficulty and partly because of beliefs about protecting the young from death's contamination. Sometimes, only the bearers and perhaps one or two close family members made the full journey. The silence rule deserves deeper examination. Many corpse roads had traditions of complete silence during the journey, or at least minimal conversation. The reasons were partly practical, conserving energy for the physical task at hand, but supernatural beliefs also played a role. Speaking unnecessarily was thought to attract the attention of spirits or even allow the deceased soul to become confused about its journey. Some traditions held that the last person to speak to a corpse before burial would be the next to die. Whether people truly believed this or simply used it to enforce solemn behavior is unclear, but the custom persisted. What happened if bearers failed to complete the journey? This was a serious situation. Bad weather, injury, or sheer exhaustion might make continuing impossible. In some cases, the procession would shelter wherever possible and resume the next day. But there are stories, difficult to verify but persistent in oral tradition, of funeral parties forced to abandon their burden temporarily, marking the spot and returning later to complete the journey. The shame associated with this failure was immense, seen as abandoning the dead to spiritual danger. The physical toll on bearers was severe. Carrying heavy weight for hours caused back strain, shoulder injuries, blistered hands from rough rope or wooden handles. Older men, or those with health problems, might participate in the early stages, but could not complete entire journeys. This created a rotation system where some bearers would accompany the procession for a portion of the route before turning back, replaced by others from nearby settlements who joined specifically to help. The dead were carried by relays of the living. Some traditions involved specific prayers or actions at particular landmarks along the route. A certain hill might require a prayer for strength. A dangerous crossing might invoke protection. Stone crosses positioned along corpse roads marked places where formal prayers were expected. These rituals broke up the journey into segments, creating a structured experience rather than simply an exhausting slog across difficult terrain. Food and drink for bearers presented practical concerns. Long journeys required sustenance, but eating and drinking during a funeral procession felt disrespectful. Different communities handled this differently. Some allowed brief meal breaks at corpse stones. Others insisted bearers fast until reaching the churchyard. Practical necessity often won out over ritual ideals, especially on multi-day journeys, but the tension between physical need and proper respect remained. Upon finally reaching the parish church, the exhausted procession entered through the Lich Gate, a roofed gateway specifically designed to shelter coffins while final prayers were said. The body rested there briefly, allowing bearers one last moment to compose themselves before the burial service. The churchyard represented the journey's end, consecrated ground where the deceased could finally be laid to rest properly. The relief bearers felt must have been immense, both from physical exhaustion and from completing their sacred duty. But the journey wasn't quite over. After the burial, bearers faced the return trip home, now without their burden, but still exhausted. The return was sometimes made along the same corpse road, though walking without carrying a body allowed for faster travel and perhaps more willingness to take easier alternate routes. In some traditions, bearers returning from a burial were supposed to take a different path, never retracing their exact steps to prevent the dead from following them home. The practical realities of corpse roads reveal a society dealing with death in intensely physical, communal ways. Death wasn't something handled by professionals in the background. It required community participation, physical labor, endurance, and coordination. Everyone in these villages knew they would someday either be carried along these roads or serve as bearers for others. The corpse road was part of life's expected arc, a journey everyone anticipated. These journeys also created bonds between participants. Men who had carried the dead together shared an experience both physically demanding and emotionally significant. They had fulfilled a sacred obligation, ensuring their neighbor or family member reached proper burial despite difficulty and distance. This collective responsibility reinforced community ties in ways modern funeral practices cannot replicate. The corpse road journey was never just transportation. It was ritual, ordeal, community obligation, and spiritual passage all combined. Understanding these journeys means understanding a world where death demanded not just mourning, but physical participation, where getting the dead to their final rest required strength, coordination, and collective effort. The roads themselves were just paths worn into earth. The journeys they witnessed were profoundly human struggles against distance, terrain, weather, and the relentless reality of mortality. The corpse roads of medieval England existed in two realities simultaneously. One was physical, paths worn into earth by countless funeral processions. The other was supernatural, routes believed to be haunted, spiritually dangerous, and fundamentally separate from the world of the living. Understanding why people avoided these roads requires understanding a medieval worldview where the boundary between life and death was permeable, unstable, and terrifying. The fundamental belief was simple and widespread. Spirits followed their bodies. When a corpse traveled along these roads toward burial, the deceased soul traveled with it, not yet at rest, not yet released to whatever came next. The journey to consecrated ground was seen as a liminal state, a dangerous in-between time when the dead existed neither fully among the living nor properly laid to rest. The corpse road was the physical space where this transition occurred, making it inherently uncanny. This belief had immediate practical consequences. If spirits followed bodies along these specific routes, then these routes became spiritually contaminated, dangerous for the living to traverse. Walking a corpse road when no funeral was taking place meant potentially encountering restless spirits, souls confused about their state, or worse. The living simply did not use these paths for ordinary travel, even when doing so would save considerable time and effort. The phenomenon of corpse candles, also called ghost lights or death lights, appears repeatedly in accounts of these roads. Witnesses reported seeing strange lights floating along corpse roads at night, moving at the pace of a walking procession, sometimes visible for miles across dark moorland. These lights were interpreted as supernatural signs, either the spirits of the dead traveling their route or omens foretelling upcoming deaths. Some traditions held that seeing a corpse candle meant someone you knew would soon die and make that journey. Were these lights real? Possibly. Marsh gas, called will-o'-the-wisp, creates floating lights in boggy areas. Ball lightning and other atmospheric phenomena can produce strange illuminations. But for medieval observers, natural explanations were irrelevant. The lights appeared on corpse roads. Therefore, they were connected to death. The association became self-reinforcing. People expected to see strange things on these roads, so they interpreted ambiguous experiences as supernatural. Phantom funeral processions represent another layer of supernatural belief. Multiple accounts, spanning centuries, describe people witnessing full funeral processions on corpse roads, bearers carrying a coffin, mourners following, the entire scene playing out in silence or with strange muted sounds. Sometimes these phantom processions were recognized as omens, showing who would die next. Other times they were interpreted as residual hauntings, past funerals somehow imprinted on the landscape and occasionally replaying themselves. The psychological mechanism here is worth considering. If you grew up knowing a particular path was exclusively for carrying the dead, if you absorbed stories about spirits and omens from childhood, your perception, walking that path, would be primed for supernatural interpretation. Shadows become figures. Wind, sounds become voices. The mind, especially at dusk or in fog, constructs patterns from ambiguous sensory input. The corpse road became a screen onto which people projected their deepest fears about mortality. Property values near corpse roads were demonstrably lower. Owning land adjacent to these routes meant living beside death's highway. It meant hearing funeral processions pass, sometimes in the middle of the night. It meant the possibility of corpse candles drifting past your windows. It meant your children playing within sight of paths where the dead traveled. Some families accepted this, having no choice about where they lived. Others avoided such properties if they had any alternative. The social taboo against using corpse roads extended beyond supernatural fear to questions of respect and propriety. Even for those who might have been skeptical about ghosts, walking a corpse road for ordinary purposes felt disrespectful to the dead. These were sacred routes, dedicated to a specific solemn purpose. Using them casually would be like treating a church as a marketplace, a violation of the boundary between sacred and profane. Community judgment enforced this as strongly as any supernatural belief. Animals featured prominently in corpse road folklore. Dogs, particularly sensitive to things humans couldn't perceive according to folk belief, reportedly refused to walk corpse roads or behave strangely near them. Horses might shy or resist being led along these paths. Even livestock would avoid them if given the choice. Whether animals actually behaved differently, or whether people simply interpreted normal animal behavior through a supernatural lens is impossible to determine. But the belief was real and widespread. The concept of the unquiet dead adds darker dimensions to these beliefs. Not all souls traveled peacefully to their rest. Those who died violently, without confession, unbaptized, or in states of sin were thought to become especially restless. Suicides, who were denied church burial entirely, were believed to haunt the places of their death rather than traveling to consecrated ground. Murder victims might linger near the sites of their deaths. These troubled spirits were thought to be drawn to corpse roads, recognizing them as paths to the rest they were denied. This created genuine fear. Walking a corpse road meant potentially encountering not just ordinary deceased spirits, but actively tormented or malevolent ones. Stories circulated of travelers who ignored warnings and walked these roads alone at night, only to be found the next morning dead, mad, or so traumatized they never spoke again. Whether these stories had any basis in real events or were purely cautionary tales is less important than their effect. They reinforce the taboo powerfully. Wedding processions represented the opposite of funerals in medieval symbolism. Life, joy, fertility, new beginnings. The idea of a wedding party using a corpse road was not just inappropriate, but spiritually dangerous. Mixing the celebration of new life with the space of death was seen as inviting disaster. There are accounts of communities going to elaborate lengths to route wedding processions away from corpse roads, even when it meant much longer journeys, because the contamination risk was too great. Children were particularly protected from corpse roads, not just from traveling on them, but even from playing near them. The belief was that children, being more innocent and spiritually vulnerable than adults, were more susceptible to supernatural harm. A child wandering onto a corpse road might attract the attention of restless spirits, or worse, might have their own life force somehow drawn away. Parents enforced this boundary strictly, making corpse roads part of the landscape of fear that taught children which places were dangerous. The psychological burden on bearers themselves was considerable. These men were required by duty and custom to walk roads that everyone else avoided, carrying decomposing bodies along routes believed to be haunted. They did this not once, but repeatedly throughout their lives, as community members died and needed transport. Some bearers probably convinced themselves they were protected by their sacred duty. Others likely felt genuine fear, balanced against the stronger fear of violating community obligation or abandoning the dead. Protective rituals developed to help bearers manage this fear. Carrying iron objects was thought to ward off malevolent spirits. Saying certain prayers at specific landmarks along the route provided supernatural protection. Some traditions involved bearers marking themselves with symbols or carrying herbs believed to have protective properties. Whether these rituals actually provided psychological comfort or were performed purely from custom is unclear, but they persisted because they addressed real anxiety about the work. Living adjacent to a corpse road meant developing coping strategies. Some families hung charms on their homes, blessed items meant to keep restless spirits from approaching too close. Others simply kept shutters closed when funeral processions passed, avoiding even the sight of the dead traveling past. The sound of bearers' footsteps, the creaking of coffins, the occasional prayer or wailing became familiar but never comfortable, reminders that death passed regularly by their doors. The phenomenon of corpse roads created geographic patterns of fear. Villages had their safe spaces and their dangerous margins. Children learned these boundaries intuitively, the same way they learned which streams were safe to cross and which neighbors were kind. The corpse road existed in a separate category of space, neither fully forbidden nor fully accessible, liminal territory that connected everyday geography to the realm of death. Interestingly, not all supernatural beliefs about corpse roads were negative. Some traditions held that the spirits traveling these routes were not malevolent, but simply in transition, deserving respect rather than fear. In these interpretations, the living should avoid corpse roads, not because spirits might harm them, but because such avoidance showed proper deference to the dead. This gentler view coexisted with darker beliefs, probably varying by region and family tradition. The seasonal variation in supernatural beliefs is also notable. Winter nights, when darkness came early and weather could be brutal, were seen as especially dangerous times for corpse roads. The long nights of winter were traditionally associated with increased supernatural activity in European folklore generally, and corpse roads fit this pattern. Summer, with its longer days and warmer weather, was considered somewhat less spiritually dangerous, though the taboo against casual use remained. There were occasional necessary violations of the taboo. Someone might need to cross a corpse road to reach another destination, finding it bisected their path. In these cases, specific rituals might be performed, making the sign of the cross, saying protective prayers, or at minimum, showing visible respect by removing one's hat or bowing slightly while crossing. These small rituals acknowledge the special nature of the space while allowing necessary passage. The concept of spiritual contamination extended beyond the roads themselves. Objects that had contact with corpses, including the biers or coffins used to transport them, were considered contaminated and handled carefully. Bearers might wash themselves ritually after completing a journey. Clothes worn during funeral transport might be treated differently than ordinary garments. This wasn't about physical contamination, but spiritual, a sense that death left traces that needed to be cleansed. Modern skeptics might dismiss all these beliefs as superstition, products of ignorance and pre-scientific thinking. But that judgment misses something important. For medieval people, these beliefs were rational responses to their understanding of reality. They believed in souls, in spirits, in the persistence of consciousness after death. Given those beliefs, of course, roads used exclusively for transporting the dead would be spiritually significant and potentially dangerous. The logic was sound within their worldview. What's remarkable is how long these beliefs persisted, extending well beyond the medieval period into the 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries in remote rural areas. Long after educated urban populations had abandoned such ideas, rural communities continued to avoid corpse roads, continued to report supernatural experiences on them, continued to pass down stories and warnings to their children. The beliefs were embedded in culture so deeply that changing worldviews couldn't erase them quickly. Today, when hikers walk these routes, most have no idea of the supernatural weight these paths once carried. They see beautiful countryside, challenging trails, historic landmarks. The fear has evaporated, the taboos dissolved. But for centuries, these same paths existed in a different psychological reality, as boundaries between worlds, as dangerous liminal spaces where the living and dead occupied the same ground uneasily. Understanding that lost world of supernatural belief helps us understand just how profoundly different past relationships with death were from our own sanitized modern approach. Behind every corpse road lay a web of money, power, and ecclesiastical politics. The dead were valuable, and control over burial rites represented one of the medieval church's most reliable revenue streams and expressions of authority. Understanding corpse roads means understanding how economics and theology intertwine to create a system that served institutional interests while imposing enormous burdens on ordinary people. Burial fees formed the foundation of this economic system. Every burial in a parish churchyard required payment to the church. These fees varied by region and period, but they were never trivial for ordinary families. A typical burial fee might equal several days' wages for a laborer, sometimes more. For wealthy families, the fees were higher, scaled to what the church believed they could afford. This wasn't charity work. This was business, and the church ran it with remarkable efficiency. Beyond the basic burial fee, additional costs accumulated. Prayers for the dead, masses said for the soul's benefit, candles burned during services, fees for the priest's time and presence, all added to the total expense. Wealthy families might pay for elaborate ceremonies that could cost as much as a year's income for a common worker. Poor families scraped together what they could, sometimes going into debt, to ensure their dead received proper burial. The church's monopoly on consecrated ground meant families had no alternative, no way to negotiate or seek competitive pricing. For the mother churches that held burial monopolies, this revenue was substantial and reliable. Death was the one certainty in medieval life. Every person in the parish would eventually require burial, and the church would collect its fees. Unlike tithes, which might vary with harvest success, or donations, which depended on generosity, burial fees were consistent income. Parish churches depended on this revenue for maintenance, priest salaries, and their broader operations. This economic reality explains why mother churches defended their burial monopolies so fiercely. When remote villages petitioned for local burial rights, they weren't just asking for convenience. They were threatening to redirect revenue away from the mother church. Every burial performed locally was income lost to the central parish. The economics gave mother churches powerful incentives to deny or delay granting burial rights to daughter chapels, regardless of the hardship this created for remote communities. Legal disputes over burial rights could last generations. Church records document elaborate arguments between parishes about which church had rightful jurisdiction over particular villages or even individual families. These weren't abstract theological debates. They were fights over money and power. The winning parish gained reliable income. The losing parish saw its revenue stream diminish. Canon law, the church's internal legal system, provided frameworks for resolving these disputes, but the process was slow and often favored established churches over newer or smaller ones. Consider the actual numbers involved. A mother church serving 20 villages might conduct 50 to 100 burials per year, depending on population and mortality rates. At several days' wages per burial, this represented significant income. During plague years, when mortality spiked, burial income increased proportionally, creating a grim financial windfall for churches, even as communities suffered devastating losses. The church's economic interest in death was direct and substantial. For poor families, the cost burden was crushing. When someone died, the family faced not just grief and loss, but immediate financial stress. They needed to pay burial fees they might not have. They needed to organize transport to the distant churchyard, requiring bearers, possibly overnight shelter, food for the funeral party. Some families literally could not afford to bury their dead properly. This created terrible situations where bodies might wait, decomposing, while families begged, borrowed, or worked to raise necessary funds. Charity burial arrangements developed to address extreme poverty, but these came with their own indignities. The church might agree to bury paupers at reduced fees or even free, but such burials were often minimal. Simple graves in less desirable parts of the churchyard, abbreviated ceremonies, limited prayers. Even in death, Social class determined treatment. Wealthy bodies received elaborate funerals in prime locations near the church building itself. Poor bodies went to the margins, buried quickly with minimal fuss. Guilds and burial societies emerged partly to address these economic pressures. Craftsmen, merchants, and even laborers in some areas formed associations that collected small regular contributions from members, creating funds specifically for burial expenses. When a member died, the society paid burial costs and provided bearers, ensuring proper funeral without bankrupting the family. These organizations represented early forms of insurance, mutual aid systems designed specifically to handle death's financial burden. The economics of long-distance body transport added another layer of expense. A funeral procession traveling 10 or 15 miles required food and drink for bearers, potential overnight shelter, and time away from work for everyone involved. In agricultural communities, where every day of labor mattered, spending an entire day or more on a funeral journey represented real economic cost beyond the church's direct fees. Some communities developed rotating systems to distribute this burden, but the expense remained. During plague years, the entire economic system faced crisis. The Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks killed so many people so quickly that normal burial practices became impossible. Churches were overwhelmed with bodies. Burial fees became uncollectible from families that had lost most of their members. Some churches actually reduced fees during plague peaks simply because demand exceeded capacity and families literally could not pay. Mass graves became necessary, violating everything medieval Christianity taught about individual burial in consecrated ground. The Reformation's impact on burial economics was profound and complex. Protestant theology challenged the Catholic emphasis on prayers for the dead, masses for souls, and the entire purgatory concept that justified much of the church's burial-related income. When England broke from Rome and established the Church of England, the theological basis for many burial fees weakened. But economic interests don't disappear easily. The Reformed Church still controlled burial rights and still collected fees, though the justifications shifted. Gradually, more communities gained permission to establish local burial grounds. This happened partly from theological changes that reduced emphasis on consecrated grounds' supernatural importance, partly from practical recognition that the old system was unsustainable, and partly from political changes that reduced the church's overall power. By the 17th and 18th centuries, many villages that had once relied on corpse roads gained their own churchyards. The economic decentralization was underway. But consider the legacy of those centuries when burial monopolies ruled. Entire communities organized their relationship with death around the economic reality that dying meant paying the distant mother church. Families made financial decisions throughout life with eventual burial costs in mind. The corpse road wasn't just a path through landscape, but a physical manifestation of economic extraction. The route along which wealth flowed from remote villages to central church coffers. The politics of death extended beyond simple economics into power relationships. The church's control over burial represented spiritual authority made tangible. A priest who could determine where and how someone was buried held real power over families. Denial of church burial was one of the most severe punishments available, reserved for suicides, excommunicated persons, and those who died in states of mortal sin. This threat of spiritual exile gave the church leverage over behavior during life. People feared dying in ways that might result in burial denial. Some documented cases show mother churches refusing burial to people who had offended church authorities during life. These refusals created desperate situations where families had to appeal to higher church authorities, sometimes traveling to bishops or even archbishops, begging for permission to bury their dead. The power to say no to burial was extraordinary, and churches used it, though typically as last resort rather than routine practice. The intersection of burial rights and land ownership created additional complexity. Wealthy landowners sometimes negotiated private burial rights on their estates, essentially purchasing exemption from the corpse road system. These private chapels with burial grounds represented elite privilege, allowing wealthy families to avoid the burdens that ordinary people had no choice but to endure. This class distinction in death mirrored broader medieval social hierarchies, but made them starkly visible. Church politics also involved competition between different religious orders. Monasteries, parish churches, cathedrals, each had their own jurisdictions and burial rights. Disputes weren't just between individual parishes, but sometimes between entire religious orders, competing for the same population's burial business. These conflicts could become bitter, involving appeals to bishops, papal authorities, and even secular powers when church law proved insufficient to resolve disputes. The economic value of burial rights meant they could be bought, sold, or transferred, though always within church frameworks. A wealthy monastery might purchase burial rights for a region, gaining both the income and the increased influence over local populations. These transactions were recorded in church documents, treated as property transfers of significant value. The dead were literally commodified, their inevitable need for burial converted into transferable economic rights. For remote communities subjected to this system, the politics and economics created resentment that simmered across generations. People understood they were being exploited. They saw that burial monopolies served the mother church's interests, not their own. They paid fees they could barely afford and endured difficult corpse road journeys while the church prospered. This resentment contributed to the Reformation's appeal in some regions, where Protestant ideas about reduced church power and direct relationship with God resonated with populations tired of ecclesiastical extraction. The corpse roads themselves became physical evidence of this exploitative system. Every mile worn into the landscape represented not just funeral processions, but wealth transfer, the accumulated burden of centuries of families forced to transport their dead long distances because the church would not grant local burial rights. Walking these roads today, you're walking paths created by economic and political power as much as by geography or religious belief. Understanding the economics and politics of medieval burial transforms how we see corpse roads. They weren't inevitable results of geography or even theology alone. They were products of a specific system of power and profit, one that prioritized institutional church interests over community welfare. The roads existed because the church had power to enforce burial monopolies and economic incentives to maintain them. The human cost, the difficult journeys, and heavy burdens were externalities that the system's beneficiaries could ignore because they were paid by people with no alternative. The corpse roads haven't vanished. They're still there, written into the landscape of northern England in ways both obvious and subtle. Modern discovery of these routes combines archaeology, historical cartography, linguistic analysis, and local memory, revealing a network of death's highways that most people walk without recognizing what lies beneath their feet. The most direct physical evidence comes from the paths themselves. Centuries of funeral processions, thousands of journeys, with bearers carrying heavy coffins, wore these routes into the earth in distinctive ways. Many corpse roads exist as sunken lanes, holloway paths where the surface has eroded below the surrounding ground level. This erosion pattern results from concentrated foot traffic over very long periods. When you walk a section where the path sits 2 or 3 feet below adjacent fields, you're walking a route shaped by countless dead and their bearers. The depth of erosion tells stories about usage intensity and duration. A corpse road worn 5 feet deep into bedrock represents not decades, but centuries of continuous use. Geomorphologists can estimate roughly how long such erosion would take given soil type, rainfall patterns, and typical foot traffic. These calculations suggest many corpse roads were in continuous use from the early medieval period through the 16th or 17th centuries, some even longer in especially remote areas. Corpse stones provide the most recognizable physical markers. These flat rocks, or stone outcroppings, positioned at intervals along the routes, show wear patterns consistent with their traditional use. Many display shallow depressions where coffins rested, worn smooth by wood against stone across centuries. Finding a corpse stone is like discovering a monument to exhaustion, a place where thousands of bearers set down their burdens and caught their breath before continuing. Some corpse stones are natural features that were incorporated into the corpse road system. A convenient flat boulder, already positioned at about the right distance, became a traditional resting point. Others were deliberately placed, large flat stones carried and positioned specifically for funeral processions. Distinguishing natural from placed stones can be difficult, but the pattern is clear. Roughly regular intervals, always flat surfaces suitable for setting down a coffin, often positioned where bearers would naturally need rest. Stone crosses and wayside markers provide another category of physical evidence. Many corpse roads featured crosses at significant points, difficult crossings, junctions where paths met, locations where prayers were traditionally said. Some of these crosses still stand, weathered medieval stonework that served both practical wayfinding purposes and spiritual functions. Others have fallen or been removed, but their foundations or stumps remain, identifiable to archaeologists familiar with the pattern. Boundary stones and markers sometimes reference corpse roads explicitly or implicitly. Property boundaries in medieval and early modern England were carefully documented because they determined tax obligations and legal jurisdiction. When a corpse road crossed property lines, this was noted. Some boundary markers include inscriptions or symbols indicating the special nature of paths crossing that point. These stones, often ignored or misunderstood by modern observers, preserve legal recognition of corpse roads as distinct landscape features. Place names offer rich evidence, encoding memory of corpse roads into the linguistic landscape. Lich Way appears across northern England, lich being Old English for corpse. Coffin Lane, Church Way, Burial Road. These names survive in modern maps and addresses, often in locations where the physical path has long since been plowed under or paved over. The name preserves what the landscape has forgotten. Linguistic analysis of place names reveals patterns. The the distribution of lich-related names correlates strongly with areas that had dispersed populations and centralized church burial rites, exactly the conditions that created corpse roads. Etymology helps date these names, distinguishing genuinely medieval designations from later Romantic inventions. Victorian fascination with picturesque rural traditions led to some invented folklore, but genuine medieval place names have distinctive linguistic characteristics that experts can identify. Ordnance Survey maps, Britain's systematic cartographic survey begun in the 18th century, documented many corpse roads explicitly. Early maps sometimes labeled routes as Corpse Road or Churchway, preserving information that might otherwise have been lost as the routes fell out of use. Modern researchers comparing historical map series can track how corpse roads were gradually absorbed into general footpath networks or abandoned entirely as local burial grounds made them unnecessary. Archaeological investigation of corpse roads employs techniques borrowed from studying ancient trackways and pilgrimage routes. Soil sampling can reveal compacted layers indicating heavy historical foot traffic. Phosphate analysis detects organic residues that might result from decomposition along routes where bodies were carried. These scientific approaches complement traditional historical methods, providing physical evidence to support documentary records and oral traditions. Excavations near corpse stones occasionally uncover artifacts, fragments of coffin, hardware, religious medals dropped by mourners, coins placed as offerings. These finds are rare because corpse roads weren't settlement sites where people lived and discarded material. But when artifacts appear, they provide dating evidence and material connections to the people who use these routes. A corroded coffin nail from a corpse stone excavation is a tangible link to a funeral that occurred centuries ago. Oral history and local tradition preserve knowledge that written records often miss. In villages that once relied on corpse roads, stories passed through generations about specific journeys, memorable storms that trapped funeral processions, or supernatural encounters along these routes. Folklorists and local historians collecting these accounts in the 20th century captured memories stretching back to when corpse roads were still actively used. These testimonies provide details about customs, beliefs, and practices that formal church records never documented. The pattern becomes clear when mapping all known corpse roads. They cluster in upland areas with dispersed populations, the Lake District, Yorkshire Dales, the Pennines, parts of Durham and Northumberland. Lowland areas with denser populations and more churches show fewer corpse roads because the distances between villages and parish churches were shorter. The geographic distribution reflects underlying medieval settlement patterns and church organization. Comparison with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland reveals similar patterns with regional variations. Scotland's corpse roads often included morthouses, small stone buildings where bodies could rest overnight during multi-day journeys. Wales has extensive traditions around corpse roads, with specific prayer customs and folklore. Ireland's funeral traditions emphasize communal participation, with villages turning out en masse for funeral processions even over long distances. The underlying phenomenon was widespread, but cultural responses varied. European parallels exist beyond the British Isles. Germany's Totenwege, funeral paths, served similar functions in mountainous regions where scattered villages had to transport dead to distant parish churches. Scandinavian countries have documented funeral routes with distinctive local traditions. The corpse road phenomenon wasn't unique to England. but part of broader European medieval patterns, where church burial monopolies and challenging geography combined to create dedicated funeral routes. Modern walking tours and heritage trails have recognized corpse roads' historical significance. Organizations promoting rural tourism and historical preservation have marked some routes, installed interpretive signs, and published walking guides. The Corpse Road from Mardale to Shap is now a popular hiking route, advertised for its historical interest and stunning Lake District scenery. Hikers walk it for exercise and views, largely unaware of the somber processions that once defined the path. Conservation efforts face interesting challenges. Should corpse roads be preserved as historical monuments? Many are already protected simply by being in remote areas where development pressure is minimal. But others cross land that might be developed or altered. Historic preservation authorities must balance conservation with property rights and practical land use needs. The cultural value of corpse roads competes with other priorities in landscapes that continue to change. Academic interest in corpse roads has grown significantly in recent decades. Historical geographers study them as evidence of medieval spatial organization and church power structures. Archaeologists investigate them as part of understanding death practices and landscape evolution. Folklorists examine the supernatural beliefs and traditions surrounding them. Anthropologists use them as case studies in how societies create and maintain sacred space. The corpse roads have become interdisciplinary research subjects, revealing insights relevant to multiple fields. Digital mapping projects now document corpse roads with GPS precision, creating databases that overlay historical routes onto modern satellite imagery. These projects make corpse roads accessible to researchers and interested public alike. You can view confirmed corpse roads online, see their exact paths, read historical information about specific routes. Technology has democratized access to knowledge that once existed only in scattered local histories and academic papers. What's remarkable is how much evidence remains after centuries. The landscape is durable. Stone endures. Names persist. Even when the physical path disappears under agricultural land or modern development, traces remain for those who know how to look. The corpse roads are simultaneously vanished and present, gone from daily use, but inscribed into the land indelibly. Dating techniques continue to refine our understanding of when specific corpse roads were established and how long they remained in use. Dendrochronology, analyzing wood from structures associated with corpse roads, provides precise dates. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found during excavations offers chronological frameworks. Documentary evidence from church and property records gives specific references to burial practices and route usage. Combining these methods creates detailed timelines of individual corpse roads. The relationship between corpse roads and other historic paths is complex. Some corpse roads followed sections of even more ancient trackways, prehistoric routes that medieval funeral processions adapted for their purposes. Others were created specifically as funeral routes, cutting new paths across landscape for that single purpose. Distinguishing original corpse roads from routes that only occasionally carried funeral traffic requires careful historical and archaeological analysis. Modern rediscovery of corpse roads often happens accidentally. A farmer notices a persistent line across his field where crops grow differently, indicating buried stone or compacted soil. A hiker finds an oddly positioned large flat stone and wonders about its purpose. A local historian researching village records encounters, references to the old church way, and begins investigating. These scattered discoveries gradually accumulate into comprehensive understanding of the corpse road network. What we're recovering is not just individual paths, but an entire system, a geography of death that once overlaid the everyday landscape. These roads formed a network connecting scattered settlements to burial sites, creating infrastructure specifically for mortality. Understanding this network means understanding how medieval society organized one of life's fundamental realities. The physical evidence that remains is testimony to a world where death required its own roads, where the landscape itself acknowledged and accommodated mortality in ways modern society has completely forgotten. The corpse roads of medieval England are gone from daily life, but they remain as questions, as mirrors reflecting back truths about how humans organize their relationship with mortality. What do these strange paths tell us about ourselves, about what changed, about what we gained and lost in the centuries since funeral processions last walked them? Start with the most obvious difference. Medieval people had intimate, physical relationships with death that we've almost entirely lost. When someone died in a medieval village, the community handled the body directly. Neighbors washed and prepared it. Family and friends carried it, feeling its weight across miles of difficult terrain. Everyone participated in death's logistics, not as professionals, but as ordinary people fulfilling unavoidable obligations. Death wasn't something that happened in hospitals and funeral homes managed by specialists. It was something you touched, carried, smelled, confronted directly. The corpse road journey made death communal by necessity. One family couldn't transport a body alone. The community had to coordinate, contribute bearers, organize the procession. This meant that every death involved the wider village, creating shared experiences that bound people together. Grief was public, witnessed, supported by collective participation. The burden of death, both physical and emotional, was distributed across the community rather than falling entirely on immediate family or paid professionals. Consider what we've replaced this with. Modern death is privatized, medicalized, professionalized. When someone dies, a funeral home collects the body in a specialized vehicle. Professionals prepare it in facilities the public never sees. The funeral service, if there is one, happens in carefully controlled environments designed to minimize confrontation with death's physical realities. Burial or cremation occurs with minimal family involvement in the actual logistics. Death has been removed from daily life, handled behind scenes by specialists. This transformation brought real benefits. Professional death care is more hygienic, more efficient, less physically demanding for grieving families. Modern systems handle death with dignity and competence that medieval communities couldn't match. Nobody today wants to return to carrying decomposing bodies across moorlands and storms. The medieval system wasn't romantic. It was hard, unpleasant, and often traumatic for participants. But something was lost in this transition. The physical removal of death from daily life has created a society where many people reach adulthood without ever seeing a dead body, without confronting mortality directly. Death becomes abstract, something that happens to other people, somewhere else, managed by others. This distance might reduce immediate distress, but it also reduces preparedness for the inevitability everyone eventually faces. Medieval people grew up knowing death intimately. Modern people can spend decades avoiding it entirely. The spatial separation between life and death that corpse roads embodied was real but limited. Yes, the dead traveled separate routes. Yes, funeral processions followed paths the living avoided. But these paths intersected daily geography. You could see the corpse road from your home. You heard funeral processions passing. The separation was symbolic and supernatural rather than absolute. Death remained visible, present, acknowledged within the landscape. Modern separation is far more complete. Hospitals remove the dying from communities. Funeral homes hide death's preparation. Cemeteries occupy distinct zones, often outside town centers, visited occasionally rather than encountered daily. Crematoriums process bodies in industrial facilities most people never see. Death has been zoned out of daily experience, banished to specialized spaces that most people can entirely avoid until personally confronted with loss. What invisible boundaries do we create today that future generations might find as strange as we find corpse roads? We separate the elderly into care facilities rather than keeping them in family homes. We segregate the seriously ill into hospitals rather than caring for them in communities. We process death in hidden facilities rather than in public view. These separations feel natural, efficient, proper to us, but they represent choices about how to organize relationships with aging, illness, and mortality. Different choices were possible. Different choices were made in the past. The corpse roads required communities to organize collectively around death. Everyone understood their eventual role, either as the deceased being carried or as bearers carrying others. This created a kind of social contract. I'll carry your dead because someday others will carry mine. Modern individualism has eroded these collective obligations. We pay professionals to handle death, converting communal responsibility into market transactions. This reduces social burden, but also reduces social bonding that shared obligations created. Urbanization fundamentally changed death's geography. Medieval villages were small, stable communities where everyone knew everyone. Death affected the whole village because the deceased was someone's neighbor, relative, friend. Modern cities allow anonymity. People die in apartment buildings where neighbors might not know their names. Death becomes isolated, affecting only immediate family, or even just the individual if they die alone. The communal aspect of mortality that corpse roads embodied becomes impossible in anonymous urban environments. Secularization shifted beliefs about death's spiritual significance. Medieval people believed burial in consecrated ground was essential for salvation. This belief justified the extraordinary efforts required to transport bodies to distant churchyards. Modern secularism treats burial as practical disposal rather than spiritual necessity. When death loses supernatural significance, the location and method of burial become matters of preference rather than eternal consequence. This change made corpse roads unnecessary, but it also removed the framework of meaning that made those difficult journeys feel worthwhile. The death-positive movement emerging in recent years represents a partial reaction against modern death denial. Advocates encourage more direct engagement with mortality, more open conversations about death, more involvement in caring for one's own dying and dead. Some families now choose to handle more of death's logistics themselves rather than delegating everything to professionals. This movement recognizes that something valuable was lost when death was removed entirely from ordinary life, though few advocate returning to medieval practices. There's a paradox in how modern society handles death. We've never been better at delaying it. Medical advances extend life decades beyond what medieval people could expect. Yet we're arguably worse at accepting death's inevitability. Medieval people lived with higher mortality, shorter lifespans, but possessed cultural frameworks that acknowledged death as natural and unavoidable. Modern people live longer, but often treat death as failure, as something to be fought and denied until the very end. The corpse roads were infrastructure for mortality, physical acknowledgement that death required accommodation within daily landscape. What infrastructure do we create for death today? Hospitals with specialized palliative care units, funeral homes with presentation rooms, cemeteries with landscaped grounds, crematoriums with viewing areas. These modern facilities are more comfortable, more efficient, more hygienic than anything medieval people had. But they're also more hidden, more separate, more removed from daily experience. The supernatural beliefs that surrounded corpse roads reflected genuine fear, but also acknowledgement. Medieval people believed spirits traveled these roads, that death contaminated space, that boundaries between life and death needed careful maintenance. These beliefs seem superstitious now, but they represented one way of taking death seriously, of treating it as significant rather than ignoring it. Modern rationalism has abandoned these beliefs without necessarily replacing them with equivalent frameworks for acknowledging death's significance. Communal versus individual handling of death represents perhaps the sharpest contrast. Medieval corpse roads required collective action. Modern death care is purchased individually or by families. This shift reflects broader changes in social organization, from tight-knit communities with strong mutual obligations to individualistic societies where most services are market transactions. Neither system is inherently superior, but they create very different experiences of mortality. Walking a corpse road today as a hiking trail is an act of unconscious irony. These paths that once terrified the living, that were avoided even when convenient, are now recreational routes, valued for their scenic beauty and historical interest. The taboo has completely vanished. The supernatural dread is gone. The somber purpose is forgotten by most who walk them. This transformation reveals how completely our relationship with death has changed in just a few centuries. What remains constant is death itself. Every society must develop ways to handle it, to transport bodies from where death occurs to final resting places, to organize the living around this unavoidable task. The corpse roads were one solution, products of specific geography, theology, and social organization. Our modern systems are different solutions to the same fundamental problem. Neither approach is natural or inevitable. Both are cultural constructions, choices about how to organize human societies around mortality. The quiet beauty of paths, where only the dead once traveled, holds a particular poignancy. These routes through moors and mountains, beside streams and over hills, were associated with death and grief for centuries. Now they're valued for their natural beauty, walked for pleasure and exercise. The transformation from paths of sorrow to paths of recreation is complete. Yet knowing the history changes how you experience them. A pleasant hike becomes a meditation on mortality, on how landscapes hold memory even when human purposes change entirely. Perhaps corpse roads can teach us something we need to learn again. that death deserves acknowledgement, that mortality can be accommodated within daily life without being denied or hidden, that communities can organize collectively around life's inevitable ending. We won't return to carrying bodies across moorlands, but we might find value in recovering some of the directness, the communal support, the frank acknowledgement that medieval corpse roads represented. The open questions remain. What are we losing by removing death so completely from daily experience? How might we balance modern efficiency and hygiene with more direct engagement with mortality? What new rituals or practices might help contemporary people deal with death more healthfully while respecting modern sensibilities? The corpse roads can't answer these questions, but they can help us ask them more clearly. In the end, corpse roads reveal that humans have always struggled with how to handle death, how to balance practical necessities with spiritual beliefs, how to organize communities around mortality's inevitability. The medieval solution was to create separate paths, dedicated routes, where the dead traveled toward rest while the living maintained careful distance. Our modern solution is to remove death almost entirely from public view, delegating it to professionals in specialized facilities. Each approach reflects its era's values, technologies, and beliefs. Understanding past solutions helps us evaluate present ones more critically, recognizing that current practices are choices rather than inevitabilities. The corpse roads are gone from use, but not from landscape or memory. They remain as evidence that other ways are possible, other relationships with death existed, and the boundaries between life and mortality have always been matters of human construction, not natural law. Walking where only the dead once traveled becomes an act of remembering, of recovering knowledge our culture has deliberately forgotten.